Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. I think those of us who are in the research field of mis and disinformation are increasingly feeling a sense of frustration, maybe that it seems that the empirical evidence that we've collected over the last previous years isn't always accurately reflected in the public discourse. And so I'm always happy to try to give an insight into the state of research on this topic, because it seems to me that some of the empirical findings in the field may be surprising, may even be somewhat counterintuitive. It is quite evident that our interest in this topic has exploded since 2015 and 2016, mainly due to the assumption that fake news played a major role in helping Donald Trump win the White House, and of course in swaying the Brexit election. We can see that in several analyses that look at interest in and coverage of the fake news or mis and disinformation topic. Here you can see on the one hand a coverage of the fake news and misinformation topic in newspapers, and also the volume of Google searches for the topic, and you can pinpoint the exact point of time when the fascination with this topic has exploded, which, as I said, was in 2015, 2016, around these political events. And as always, science is a little bit slower than journalism, but on the top you can see the violet line going up steadily and steadily is the volume of peer-reviewed publications on fake news, mis and disinformation, which you can also see has grown significantly since 2016. So I would say that we actually have a sizable volume of empirical evidence, although critically I would mention that a lot of this research is focused on the United States. What we find increasingly is that it's quite difficult to disentangle the terminology. So fake news used to describe fictitious, misleading content that was published for fraudulent, mostly economic purposes, just to swindle advertising revenue, and wasn't necessarily motivated by political considerations. The disinformation topics, as we just heard, is very old, and it used to denote influence campaigns by foreign governments, mainly with the purpose of disrupting political processes in other countries. What we've witnessed in recent years is that the disinformation term has expanded significantly and now also includes domestic actors and the misleading content that is published by those. What distinguishes disinformation and misinformation is mainly the intent of the communicator. So if the communicator intends to mislead, we're speaking of disinformation. If the intent isn't known or isn't present, but the audience is still misled, then we prefer the term misinformation. But in each case, these terms can mean very different things and tend to be somewhat fuzzy and difficult to operationalize. There are a couple of studies that look at disinformation in a narrower topic, specifically at the Russian disinformation during the 2016 election in the United States. And I would say the best-in-class studies combine survey data with tracking data. So they actually observe the actual surfing and reading behavior of users on the internet, on desktop PCs or mobile or both, and then combine these data with survey data to analyze whether there is any effect of encountering this type of disinformation on political attitudes, political knowledge, or political behavior. Now, I think these types of studies are among the first that were a little bit surprising when they were published, because first of all, it turned out that the reach of this Russian disinformation, we know most about the Russian disinformation on Twitter, because Twitter is the most, or used to be the most transparent platform. The reach of this disinformation is very, very limited. And as a result, we find that none of these studies can find any significant relationship between encountering Russian disinformation and political attitudes, political knowledge, or political behaviors. So it seems that maybe Twitter wasn't the focus of these disinformation campaigns, but I think a more plausible explanation here is just that the reach of these accounts was actually very limited and downright drowned out by other content users encountered online. But an important finding is that encountering disinformation is also very heavily concentrated in small niches of users. So a very small number of users account for most exposure to and engagement with this type of content. So if we do not see a widespread effect of this type of disinformation in the broader population, maybe that's because it has this is too narrow a definition of misinformation. So we have a number of studies today that expand the meaning of mis and disinformation and include untrustworthy sites or hyper-partisan sites like Breitbart, for example. And so they look at a much wider universe of content being produced. And again, the best studies combine survey and tracking data. What we can see in case of Europe is that the reach of these platforms is very, very limited in Europe as well. So in France and Italy, for example, the most recent findings showed that about 1 to 3% of the population actually visited these types of websites, and very similar data was found in the United States, leading to the insight that fake news comprises only 0.15% of what Americans actually encounter on the internet daily, and that is mainly due to the fact that citizens encounter very little news. So this is from the same study. If we look at the news consumption, and this study is noteworthy because it combines offline data with online data. It also looks at TV news consumption, but also online news consumption. And you can see here in the blue tones that most of what people consume online and on television has nothing to do with news. So only the green on top is actually news content. And again, if we zoom into the news content, you see a very, very thin little red line on top. And that is actually the fake news content that is consumed online or on television. So another recent study, I think, very nicely summarized the current state of research, finding that, first of all, news consumption is a relatively small part of what citizens consume online or on television. Secondly, within this section of news that people encounter online, fake news is a very small part again. So this finding summarizes that about 0.1% of what users encounter online on average could be categorized as fake news. This leads me to the question of what the role of journalism is, because now we also have quite good evidence that if users actually know about fake news stories, it seems that they don't really encounter, usually they encounter this fake news directly and personally online, but rather they learn about this fake news through established journalism. Since established journalism constitutes the vast majority of the news that is being consumed by citizens, it is just reasonable to expect that if people learn of fake news items, it is because established journalists pick up these fake news stories, sometimes to fact check them, or usually actually to fact check them. And that actually gives these fake news items much more publicity than they would usually receive. There is also some tracking data that hints at the fact that some degree of the traffic that these untrustworthy sites receive is through fact-checking services, because people encounter these fact checks and then get curious about the fake news that is being targeted by the fact check, and then actually click on the link and thereby actually reach the fake news site. So I think journalism really has to struggle with the fact that in the empirical reality is that the reach of actual fake news sites is very, very limited, and that it is drowned out by established high quality news. And therefore there is an agenda setting question to be struggled with, whether at what point it is necessary to actually address fake news in journalistic reporting, because we have to assume that this will actually give additional attention to fake news. We also know from empirical studies that the more reporting there is on the fake news challenge, the more we see a loss of institutional trust in the population. And problematically, this loss of institutional trust isn't specifically targeted at fake news. If that was the case, then it would be very helpful to actually give a lot of coverage to fake news. But we find that audiences don't really distinguish in their rising cynicism towards the news that they encounter online. And therefore, the more coverage of fake news we have, the more loss of trust we see both in fake news and in high quality news. And that, I think, is very problematic because, again, we know empirically that the vast majority of the news that people consume online and offline is actually high quality news. And so therefore, a loss of trust in news comes mainly at the cost of high quality news. So I think we have to recognize the fact that on average, citizens really don't encounter much fake news, either offline or online, and thereby journalists have to really struggle with the question at what point is it necessary to give attention to put fake news on the agenda, even with the best intentions. I think a final point that I would like to make is that, as the study about the Russian disinformation shows, talking about averages is actually not very helpful when we talk about fake news, in a sense, because we know that fake news and consumption is very, very highly concentrated in a small part of the population. And therefore, what we actually see is that we have a small part of the population that encounters quite a lot of fake news because they actually actively seek out fake news. There is a lot of motivated consumption of fake news. But the average citizen thereby, in contrast, actually barely encounters any fake news at all, because the average is actually pulled up by the small minority of heavy fake news users. So I think we actually have two very distinct problems. We have one aspect in terms of the general population, where we carefully have to balance whether to address fake news in mainstream outlets or not. And then we have a little small segment of the population that is very heavily engaged in consuming and spreading fake news, based on their intention and their interest. And the question really is, what is a helpful intervention to reach this audience, which is an incredibly difficult question to answer. And I think most colleagues would agree that just information interventions would not be sufficient. We probably need offline interventions to reach these audiences and to change some of their perceptions of the institutional setting of our democratic systems and also of the role of media. Thank you very much for your attention.